The family business was stealing from elderly neighbors, and I was the key. I mean that literally. I was 9 years old when I realized the elderly woman hugging me at her front door had just given my mother access to her bedroom safe. Mrs. Delacroix handed me a butterscotch candy and told me I was the sweetest child in the neighborhood while my mother disappeared down the hallway. I sat on the floral couch making small talk about my piano recital, keeping Mrs. Delacroix distracted exactly as I'd been trained to do. My mother returned 12 minutes later with a warm smile and empty hands, but her purse sat heavier on her shoulder than when we'd arrived. We left with Mrs. Delacroix waving from her porch, completely unaware that $4,000 in cash and her grandmother's emerald brooch were leaving with us. In the car, my mother counted out 5 $20 bills and handed them to me. "Good work today, Lily. You kept her talking exactly long enough. That's my smart girl." I took the money because I was 9 and didn't understand I was being paid for helping rob a lonely widow who'd invited us for tea. The business started before I was born. My father, Graham Sullivan, had been running home repair scams on elderly homeowners for 15 years before he married my mother, Caroline, who brought a new dimension to the operation. She realized that older people, especially those living alone, craved connection and trusted families with children. So they had me. My earliest memories involve being dressed in pretty dresses and taught to smile sweetly and compliment people's homes. By age 5, I could make any grandmother melt with a well-placed comment about their garden or their late husband's military portrait. By 7, I knew how to keep someone engaged in conversation for exactly 15 minutes while my parents searched their home for valuables. By 9, I understood the routine so completely that I could identify which neighbors were good targets just by watching their daily patterns. My parents called it the family business. I called it what we did. I didn't have another frame of reference. Our neighborhood in suburban Portland was perfect for the operation. Older homes, long-term residents, many elderly people aging in place after their spouses died and their children moved away. We lived at 2847 Meadowbrook Drive in a well-maintained 2-story colonial that my father had purchased with stolen money, but maintained impeccably to project success and trustworthiness. My mother volunteered at the senior center. My father served on the neighborhood watch committee. They were pillars of the community, which gave them unlimited access to vulnerable people. I was their weapon, the innocent, charming daughter who could get invited anywhere, who could ask to use the bathroom and unlock a back door, who could admire jewelry and learn where it was kept, who could mention my parents needed to borrow something and create an excuse for them to enter someone's home. I was their skeleton key to locked doors and locked hearts. Mrs. Delacroix was the first I remember clearly, but she wasn't the first we'd stolen from. My mother kept a notebook with names, addresses, and detailed inventories of what each elderly neighbor owned. She'd started it when I was 4, building relationships slowly, gathering information, planning thefts months in advance. The genius of their system was that nobody suspected theft immediately. An elderly person would misplace something and assume they'd forgotten where they'd put it. By the time they realized items were actually missing, weeks had passed and they had no idea who might have taken them. And they'd never suspect the nice young family who visited regularly, who helped with yard work, who brought over casseroles and seemed so kind. My parents had stolen from 17 different neighbors by the time I turned 10, accumulating over $200,000 in cash, jewelry, and collectibles that my father sold through contacts in Seattle. The system worked flawlessly until I started understanding what we were doing. Around age 11, I began asking questions. Why did Mrs. Yamada cry when she couldn't find her husband's pocket watch? Why did Mr. Foster seem confused about his missing coin collection? My mother's answer was always the same. Old people forget things, honey. We're actually helping them by taking items they can't care for properly. Everything we take goes to people who will appreciate it. That reasoning worked when I was younger, but at 11, I was old enough to recognize a lie. Mrs. Yamada hadn't forgotten her husband's watch. We'd stolen it while I distracted her with questions about her grandchildren. Mr. Foster's coin collection hadn't vanished into thin air. My father had taken it during a home inspection, while I kept Mr. Foster occupied with cookies on his front porch. I was complicit in making elderly people feel confused, making them question their own memories, making them feel less capable and more dependent. I tried to stop participating when I was 12, told my parents I didn't want to visit neighbors anymore. My father's response was to grab my arm hard enough to leave bruises and explain that the family business was not optional. You benefit from everything we provide. This house, your clothes, your food, your music lessons, all of it comes from our work. You're part of this family, which means you're part of the business. If you refuse to help, you're stealing from us. My mother added the emotional manipulation. Lily, we do this together. That's what makes us special. Other families don't have what we have. You're gifted at connecting with people. Why would you waste that gift? The combination of physical intimidation from my father and guilt from my mother kept me compliant for 2 more years. I continued being their key, hating myself more with each theft, but too scared and too conditioned to refuse. At 14, something changed. We'd just finished robbing Mr. Castellanos, an 83-year-old veteran who lived 3 houses down. I'd spent 30 minutes looking at his war medals while my father cleaned out his bedroom dresser where he kept cash and his late wife's jewelry. As we left, Mr. Castellanos hugged me and said, "You remind me of my granddaughter. She doesn't visit much anymore. Thank you for spending time with an old man. That night, I couldn't sleep. Mr. Castellanos thought I cared about him. He trusted me. And I'd repaid that trust by helping my parents steal $7,000 in irreplaceable family heirlooms. I stared at the ceiling of my bedroom, walls painted pale yellow and decorated with ribbons from piano competitions I'd won using a piano purchased with stolen money, and realized I couldn't keep doing this. But stopping meant confronting my parents, and confronting them meant risking their rage and potentially destroying the only life I'd ever known. I started documenting everything. I'd always been good at remembering details, a skill my parents had cultivated for the business, but now I used it against them. I created a coded journal listing every neighbor we'd stolen from, approximate dates, what was taken, and how much my parents claimed each theft was worth. I took photos of my mother's inventory notebook when she left it out. I recorded conversations on my phone where my parents discussed upcoming targets. Over 6 months, I built a comprehensive record of their operation. I wasn't sure what I'd do with the information, but some instinct told me I needed evidence of what was happening. At 14, I didn't have the courage to go to the police, but I needed something to prove I wasn't crazy for thinking this was wrong. My parents had spent my entire life normalizing theft, and I needed proof that I wasn't the problem. My younger sister Poppy was born when I was 15. I remember the terror I felt watching my parents bring her home from the hospital. They were going to do to her exactly what they'd done to me. Raise her to be a charming, trustworthy child who could manipulate elderly people into lowering their defenses. Poppy would become the new key, especially as I got older and less innocent looking. I tried to protect her, spending as much time with her as possible, but by the time Poppy turned 4, she was already being trained. My mother would have her practice smiling and making eye contact with strangers at the grocery store. My father taught her to compliment people's clothes and ask friendly questions. I watched my baby sister being shaped into a weapon, and I couldn't stop it without exposing the entire operation and destroying our family. When I was 16, something happened that changed everything. Mrs. Delacroix died. The woman who'd been our first major target, who'd welcomed us into her home dozens of times over the years, passed away in her sleep. At her funeral, her son spoke about how confused and sad she'd been in her final years. How she'd kept losing things and couldn't understand what was happening. How she'd worried she was developing dementia. Her son's voice broke when he described finding his mother crying because she couldn't find the emerald brooch his father had given her on their 50th anniversary. The brooch my mother had stolen 7 years earlier while I ate butterscotch candy on a floral couch. Mrs. Delacroix had spent years thinking she was losing her mind, questioning her memory, feeling guilty for losing family heirlooms. And she'd died without knowing the truth. We'd stolen from her repeatedly, and she'd blamed herself. That realization broke something in me. I went home after the funeral and confronted my mother, told her what we'd done was evil, that we'd tortured Mrs. Delacroix psychologically, that I wanted out of the family business. My mother's face went cold. You have no moral authority here, Lily. You've been part of this for over a decade. You've benefited from every single theft. The college fund sitting in your name? That's Mrs. Delacroix's money. Your car? That came from the Fosters. Your entire life is built on what you're now calling evil. You don't get to develop a conscience at 16 and pretend you're better than us. She was right. I'd spent years being their key. I'd accumulated blood money in the form of savings accounts and possessions. But I was also 16 and finally old enough to understand that what my parents had done to me was child abuse. They'd trained me to commit crimes before I was old enough to understand what I was doing. They'd exploited my natural trust and sweetness to hurt vulnerable people. And now they were doing the same thing to Poppy. I called the police hotline from my school counselor's office. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I told the operator that my parents had been systematically stealing from elderly neighbors for years and I had documentation. The operator asked my age, asked if I was safe, asked if I needed immediate help. I gave them my address and said I'd meet them after school with evidence. That afternoon, 2 detectives arrived at my house while my parents were out with Poppy at the park. I'd timed it deliberately, wanting to talk without them there. Detective Francine Liu and Detective Omar Williams sat in our living room while I explained everything. They didn't interrupt, just took notes and recorded my statement. When I finished, Detective Liu asked the hardest question. Why now? Why come forward after so many years? I told them about Mrs. Delacroix's funeral, about Poppy being trained, about the coded journal I'd kept. I showed them photos of my mother's inventory notebook and played recordings of my parents discussing targets. Detective Williams looked at the evidence and then at me. You understand that by coming forward, you're implicating yourself as well? You participated in these thefts, even if you were a minor and being coerced. There could be legal consequences for you. I understood. I also understood that stopping my parents was worth whatever happened to me. I was more terrified of becoming like them than I was of facing consequences. The detectives said they'd open an investigation and would need to interview my parents. They asked if I had somewhere safe to stay, and I mentioned my maternal grandmother who lived an hour away and had no idea what her daughter did for a living. The detectives called her, explained there was a family situation, and arranged for me to stay with her temporarily. I packed a bag, grabbed my documentation, and left before my parents came home. My mother called 40 minutes later. Her voice was pure venom. You called the police. You betrayed your own family. Do you understand what you've done? I told her I understood perfectly. I'd stopped them from stealing from more vulnerable people and from destroying Poppy the way they'd destroyed me. My father grabbed the phone. You're dead to us. You hear me? You're not our daughter anymore. And when the police realize you were part of everything, you'll go to jail too. You're as guilty as we are. He wasn't wrong about my guilt, but he was wrong about my motivation. I wasn't trying to escape punishment. I was trying to stop the cycle. After he hung up, I sat on my grandmother's couch and cried for 3 hours. I'd just destroyed my family, exposed my own crimes, and potentially ruined my entire future. But at least Poppy might have a chance at a normal life. The investigation moved faster than I expected. Detectives interviewed neighbors, collected evidence from our home, and traced stolen items through my father's selling network. Within a week, they'd confirmed at least 23 separate thefts spanning 12 years. The total value exceeded $300,000. My parents were arrested on multiple counts of theft, elder abuse, and fraud. But something else emerged during the investigation that I hadn't known. My parents weren't the only ones running this type of operation. Detective Lou called me in for another interview and explained they'd discovered a network. Your father has been meeting regularly with 4 other men who run similar operations using their own children. They trade information about techniques, share contacts for selling stolen goods, and even coordinate to avoid targeting the same neighborhoods. This isn't just your family, Lily. This is organized crime involving at least 5 families and potentially dozens of child victims. The network revelation changed everything. What I'd thought was my family's private evil was actually part of a larger system. 5 families across 3 counties, all using their children to steal from elderly people. The coordination meant they'd refined their techniques, shared strategies for avoiding detection, and created a support system that normalized the abuse. Detective Williams showed me photos of the other families involved. I recognized 2 of the fathers from neighborhood events, men who my father had claimed were business associates. One family lived just 6 blocks away, and their 11-year-old daughter attended my school. I'd seen her around, noticed how unusually polite and charming she was with adults, how teachers always commented on her maturity. Now I understood why. She was being trained exactly as I had been, turned into a key for her parents to unlock elderly people's trust in homes. The detectives asked if I'd be willing to testify about the network, not just my parents' crimes. I agreed immediately. This was bigger than my family now. There were other kids trapped in the same system, being taught that exploiting vulnerable people was normal family business. If I could help break the entire network, maybe those kids could escape before they ended up as damaged as I was. Over the next 2 months, I spent dozens of hours with prosecutors, explaining how the system worked, identifying tactics the families used, describing how children were trained and coerced. The prosecutors built a massive case against all 5 families. The charges included organized theft, elder abuse, child exploitation, money laundering, and conspiracy. The trial would take months, but the prosecutors were confident. They had my testimony, physical evidence seized from multiple homes, financial records, and statements from victimized neighbors who'd finally learned why they'd been losing things for years. My parents' lawyer tried to paint me as a vindictive teenager who'd made up stories to hurt them, but my documentation was too detailed, too extensive to be fabricated. I'd recorded conversations where my parents explicitly discussed stealing from specific neighbors. I'd photographed inventory lists with their handwriting. I had a journal spanning years that correlated with confirmed thefts. The lawyer's strategy shifted to arguing that I was equally guilty, and my testimony should be dismissed as the words of a co-conspirator. That's when the prosecution made a deal. In exchange for my full cooperation and testimony against all 5 families, I'd receive immunity from prosecution based on my age when most crimes occurred and the coercive environment I'd been raised in. I wasn't being let off free. I'd have to complete community service, undergo therapy, and work with elder advocacy groups. But I wouldn't face criminal charges for thefts I'd participated in as a child. The community reaction was devastating. Our neighborhood, which had seemed so perfect and safe, was revealed as a hunting ground for organized criminals who'd targeted the most vulnerable residents. The local news covered the story extensively. "Theft ring used children to rob elderly neighbors" was the headline that destroyed any remaining privacy. My face was blurred in photos since I was a minor, but everyone at school knew who I was. Some students called me a hero for exposing my parents. Others called me a snitch and a criminal who'd gotten away with it. Teachers didn't know how to handle me. I was simultaneously a victim of child abuse and a perpetrator of elder abuse. Both things were true, and people didn't know which to emphasize. I stopped going to school and finished my junior year through online classes while living with my grandmother, who'd aged 10 years and 2 months processing what her daughter had done. Poppy was placed with my grandmother as well after Child Protective Services removed her from my parents' custody. At 6 years old, she was confused and scared. She knew Mommy and Daddy were in trouble but didn't understand why. I tried to explain in age-appropriate terms that what our parents had taught us was wrong, that we weren't supposed to trick people or help them take things that didn't belong to us. Poppy looked at me with these huge innocent eyes and said, "But Daddy said we were helping people remember where they put things." The depth of the indoctrination made me sick. At 6, Poppy already believed the same lies I'd believed at her age. Breaking that conditioning would take years of therapy and deprogramming. I made it my mission to be the big sister she needed, to show her what normal looked like, to protect her from becoming what I'd been. The trials began when I was 17. 5 families prosecuted simultaneously in coordinated proceedings. The courtroom was packed with elderly victims, journalists, and family members trying to understand how this had happened. I testified for 2 full days, walking through the techniques we'd used, describing specific thefts, explaining how children were trained and controlled. I had to describe keeping Mrs. Delacroix distracted while my mother stole from her bedroom. I had to admit to unlocking back doors and providing information that enabled thefts. I had to acknowledge that I'd accepted money for helping rob people who trusted me. The defense attorneys tried to destroy my credibility, calling me a manipulative liar who'd learned from my parents. They weren't entirely wrong. I had learned manipulation from my parents. I just finally learned to feel guilty about it. The most difficult testimony came when prosecutors asked me to describe the psychological impact on victims. I had to explain how Mrs. Delacroix had questioned her memory, how Mr. Foster had become paranoid about his own home, how Mrs. Yamada had stopped wearing jewelry because she was afraid she'd lose it. The thefts hadn't just cost money and possessions, they'd cost these elderly people their sense of safety, their confidence in their own minds, their ability to trust neighbors and accept help. We'd made them doubt themselves during the most vulnerable time of their lives. Some had been so confused by missing items that they'd sought medical evaluation for dementia. Others had isolated themselves, afraid to let anyone into their homes. The psychological damage was harder to quantify than financial loss, but it was just as real and far more permanent. The prosecution presented evidence of the network's coordination. Meeting notes where the 5 fathers discussed which neighborhoods were ripe for targeting. Text messages comparing techniques and celebrating successful thefts. Financial records showing they'd sold items to the same fences and dealers. The network had operated for over 15 years, stealing an estimated $1.2 million from elderly victims across 3 counties. They'd refined their system to the point where it seemed impossible to detect. Use children to build trust. Steal small amounts from multiple people rather than large amounts from one person. Space out thefts so patterns weren't obvious, and maintain perfect community reputations. The system had worked flawlessly until I'd broken rank and exposed it. Detective Liu testified about finding 4 other children in the network who'd been used as keys just like me. The youngest was 8 years old. During home searches, they'd found training materials, scripts for children to use when talking to elderly neighbors, and reward systems based on successful theft participation. One father had kept a spreadsheet tracking how much each theft had netted and which of his children had contributed. His 13-year-old son had participated in 43 separate thefts and received over $12,000 in payments disguised as allowance. That son sat in the courtroom gallery, looking exactly as I'd felt 2 years earlier, confused, ashamed, scared, and complicit. I tried to make eye contact with him, tried to communicate that I understood, but he just stared at the floor. My father's testimony was chilling. He showed no remorse, instead arguing that he'd provided valuable services. These elderly people were living alone with valuables they couldn't protect. We simply redistributed resources to people who could use them. The children weren't being exploited. They were learning valuable skills about reading people and building relationships. My daughter only turned against us because she wanted to rebel and found a dramatic way to do it. The prosecutor asked him directly if he understood he'd taught his children to prey on vulnerable people. My father smiled. I taught my children that resources go to those clever enough to acquire them. That's not abuse. That's reality. The jury's expressions showed exactly what they thought of his reality. My mother's testimony was different. She cried, claimed she'd been controlled by my father, said she'd wanted to stop but was afraid. It was a performance, and I recognized every manipulation tactic because she'd taught them to me. The prosecutor played recordings I'd made where my mother was clearly the one planning thefts and managing the inventory of stolen items. Her lawyer tried to argue the recordings were taken out of context, but the evidence was overwhelming. My mother had been an equal partner in the operation, possibly even the mastermind. Her specialty was emotional manipulation, building deep relationships with victims so they never suspected her. She'd been better at it than my father, which made her more dangerous. The defense's strategy for all 5 families was essentially the same. Blame the children for exaggerating, claim the thefts were misunderstandings, argue that elderly people actually had lost items through forgetfulness and the families were being scapegoated. The strategy failed because the evidence was too concrete. Police had recovered stolen items from the families' homes and storage units. Financial records showed suspicious cash deposits that correlated with thefts. Multiple neighbors identified the families as frequent visitors who'd had access to their homes. And critically, the network's own documentation destroyed their denials. They'd kept records of their crimes, confident they'd never be caught. The verdicts came in March when I was 17. All 5 families, guilty on multiple counts. The sentences varied based on the value of thefts and extent of participation. My father received 12 years in state prison. My mother got 10 years. The other families received sentences ranging from 8 to 15 years. Additionally, all parents were ordered to pay restitution to victims, totaling over $1.5 million, including damages. They'd lost custody of their children permanently. The judge's statement at sentencing was brutal. You didn't just steal money and possessions. You stole peace of mind from elderly victims and innocence from your own children. You weaponized the trust that should exist between generations. You turned childhood into a criminal enterprise. These sentences reflect the severity and premeditation of your actions. After the sentencing, several elderly victims approached me outside the courthouse. Mr. Foster, who was now 89, put his shaking hand on my shoulder. You were a child when they made you help steal from me. I don't blame you. I blame them. Thank you for finding the courage to stop it. Mrs. Yamada hugged me and cried. My husband's watch is gone forever, but knowing what really happened gives me peace. I thought I was losing my mind. Thank you for giving me the truth. Their forgiveness was harder to accept than blame would have been. I didn't deserve their kindness. I'd participated in their victimization, even if I'd been coerced. But they saw me as another victim of my parents' crimes, and their compassion started the slow process of me forgiving myself. The 4 other children from the network families were placed with relatives or in foster care. I tried to reach out to them through social services, hoping we could support each other, but most wanted nothing to do with me. I was the one who'd exposed everything, who'd sent their parents to prison, who'd destroyed their families. They weren't ready to see me as someone who'd freed them rather than betrayed them. Maybe they'd never be ready, or maybe they'd need years of therapy before they could process what had been done to them. I understood either way. Healing from this kind of abuse wasn't linear, and everyone's timeline was different. Poppy adjusted better than I expected. My grandmother enrolled her in play therapy, where she slowly unlearned the manipulative behaviors our parents had taught her. She started kindergarten the following year at a school where nobody knew our family history. I watched her make friends normally, without the calculated charm I'd seen our parents training into her. She played and laughed and acted like a regular kid. Sometimes I'd catch her being extra polite to an adult in a way that felt too practiced, and I'd gently remind her that she could just be herself. She didn't have to perform for people's approval. Breaking those patterns was going to be a lifelong process, but at least she was starting young enough that she might not remember much of the training. I finished high school online and got accepted to Portland State with a full scholarship funded by an elder advocacy organization that wanted to support survivors of familial crime networks. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was going to college on charity meant for people my family had victimized. My grandmother insisted I accept it, arguing that education was how I'd transform my experience into something meaningful. I majored in social work with a focus on elder abuse prevention. If I couldn't undo the harm I'd caused, at least I could dedicate my career to preventing it from happening to others. My professors were initially uncomfortable when they learned my background, but my practical experience with manipulation tactics made me valuable in developing prevention programs. During my freshman year, I started speaking at senior centers about how theft rings operate and how to protect against them. Standing in front of elderly audiences and explaining the tactics my family had used was terrifying and cathartic. I describe how children were used to build trust, how families would gradually increase visit frequency before a theft, how to recognize when someone was gathering information rather than making genuine conversation. The seniors would ask questions, and I'd answer honestly, including admitting my own participation. Some audiences were hostile, viewing me as a criminal giving advice I had no right to give. Others were grateful for the insider perspective. One woman told me, "You were a child soldier in a war against the elderly. Now you're a defector sharing enemy tactics. That's valuable." My relationship with my parents ended the day they were arrested. I never visited them in prison, never responded to their letters. My father wrote monthly for the first year, each letter alternating between rage and attempts to guilt me into supporting their appeals. "You destroyed your family for attention. You'll regret this for the rest of your life." My mother's letters were more manipulative, claiming she'd only participated because my father threatened her, insisting she loved me and wanted a relationship with her daughters. Both were lies. I kept the letters as documentation but never responded. The parents I'd once trusted to protect me had instead exploited me for profit. That betrayal wasn't something I could forgive, and I didn't owe them the performance of trying. Poppy asked about them sometimes. She was too young to fully understand why our parents were gone, just that they'd done something wrong and couldn't come home. I tried to give age-appropriate explanations. Mom and Dad made bad choices that hurt people. They have to stay in a place where they can think about what they did. As she got older, I'd explain more. For now, she needed stability and normalcy more than she needed the full truth. My grandmother provided that stability, becoming the parent Poppy deserved. Watching their relationship develop, seeing how a healthy parent-child bond should function, made me realize how damaged my own childhood had been. I connected with 2 of the other network children during my sophomore year. The 13-year-old boy from the courtroom, now 15, and his 10-year-old sister reached out through a support group for survivors of familial exploitation. We met at a coffee shop and spent 3 hours sharing experiences. They described training almost identical to mine, the same reward systems, the same normalization of theft. Their father had been sentenced to 14 years, and they were living with an aunt who was trying to understand how to help them. We formed a support group, meeting monthly to process our trauma together. Having people who understood the specific guilt of being simultaneously victim and perpetrator was invaluable. They were the only ones who didn't need me to explain why I both hated my parents and missed the family I'd thought we were. Detective Liu kept in touch over the years. She said the network case had led to the creation of a task force specifically focused on family-based elder exploitation. They'd identified similar operations in other regions and were developing protocols for detecting the pattern. Using children to commit crimes created a unique investigation challenge because the children were both witnesses and perpetrators, victims and accomplices. Liu said my testimony had been crucial in establishing how to approach these cases. You showed us that children in these situations need intervention and support, not prosecution. That changed how we handle these investigations. Knowing something positive had come from my testimony helped ease the guilt of having participated in the crimes for so many years. The financial restitution my parents owed was impossible for them to pay. Their assets had been seized and liquidated, but the total was less than $400,000, nowhere near the $1.5 million they'd been ordered to pay. The victims would never be made whole financially. The elderly neighbors who'd been robbed received partial payments from the asset liquidation, but most would never recover their stolen heirlooms or irreplaceable items. Mrs. Yamada never got her husband's watch back. Mr. Castellanos' war medals were never recovered. Mrs. Delacroix died believing she'd lost her family's emerald brooch through her own carelessness. The financial cost could be calculated, but the emotional cost was infinite. On my 21st birthday, I received a letter from Mrs. Foster, Mr. Foster's widow. He'd passed away the previous year, but she wanted me to know he'd forgiven me before he died. My husband told me to tell you that you were brave for exposing the truth, and he hoped you'd build a good life despite what your parents did to you. He wanted you to know that he never blamed you. The letter came with a check for $5,000, money she couldn't afford to give. The note explained it was for my education, a gift to support me becoming the person my parents had tried to prevent me from being. I cried for an hour, then donated the money to an elder abuse prevention charity in Mr. Foster's name. I couldn't accept money from someone my family had victimized, but I could honor his forgiveness by paying it forward. Poppy turned 13 the year I graduated with my bachelor's degree. She'd grown into a confident, kind teenager who wanted to be a veterinarian. She had no memory of training nights or inventory notebooks or being taught to manipulate elderly neighbors. My grandmother and I had successfully protected her from most of the damage our parents had inflicted on me. Sometimes I'd catch her being charming in a way that felt too calculated, a remnant of early training, but mostly she was just a normal kid. She knew our parents were in prison for stealing from elderly people, but she didn't know she'd been trained to participate. That conversation would come when she was older. For now, she deserved to be a teenager without carrying the weight of our family's crimes. I got hired by an elder advocacy nonprofit, developing programs to help seniors recognize and prevent financial exploitation. My background made me effective in ways a traditional social worker couldn't be. I understood how predators thought because I'd been trained as one. I knew which tactics worked and why, which red flags to teach people to recognize, how to build protective systems without making elderly people paranoid or isolated. My colleagues sometimes seemed uncomfortable with my past, but they couldn't deny my programs worked. Theft reports in our target communities dropped by 31% after our prevention training. That number represented real people protected from what had been done to Mrs. Delacroix and the others. My parents came up for parole when I was 25. I attended the hearings and read victim impact statements. I described growing up in a household where exploiting vulnerable people was normalized, where childhood was a training ground for crime, where love was conditional on my willingness to participate in theft. I explained how their actions had damaged not just their direct victims but me and Poppy, who'd spent years in therapy processing the abuse. The parole board denied both their requests. They'd shown no remorse, maintained their innocence, and blamed everyone else for their convictions. The board determined they remained a risk to the community. They'd be eligible for parole review again in 3 years. At 27, I was invited to speak at a national conference on elder abuse. I stood on a stage in front of 300 social workers, law enforcement, and advocates, and told my story. I described being the key, being trained to unlock elderly people's trust so my parents could rob them. I explained the guilt of participating, the complexity of being both victim and perpetrator, the long process of accepting forgiveness from people I'd harmed. After my presentation, a woman approached me crying. She'd been suspicious of her neighbors who had 2 charming children who visited elderly residents frequently. She'd dismissed her concerns as paranoid, but my presentation made her realize she might be witnessing a similar operation. She reported it to local police, and an investigation confirmed another family-based theft ring. 3 more children were freed from the same exploitation I'd endured. Poppy graduated high school at 18 and decided to become a therapist specializing in childhood trauma. My grandmother and I attended her graduation, incredibly proud of the person she'd become despite the horror of her early childhood. During her speech as valedictorian, Poppy mentioned that some people face challenges that would destroy them, but choosing to transform pain into purpose is what defines character. She didn't mention our family history specifically, but I knew she was talking about us. She'd taken the worst possible start and built something beautiful from it. That was her revenge against our parents, becoming everything they'd tried to prevent her from being. 10 years after the trial, I received notice that my father had died in prison. Complications from diabetes he'd refused to properly manage. There would be no funeral, no memorial. He'd burned every bridge and alienated everyone who'd ever cared about him. I felt nothing hearing the news. No grief, no relief, just emptiness. The man who'd fathered me had stopped being my dad the moment he'd forced me to help him rob our elderly neighbors. His death didn't change anything or heal anything. It was just a fact. My mother would be eligible for parole in 3 years. I'd already prepared my statement for her hearing, explaining why she remained dangerous and manipulative. She'd written to me monthly for 10 years, every letter a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Those letters would be Exhibit A at her parole hearing. I'm 31 now. I run a nonprofit focused on preventing elder exploitation and supporting children who've been used in family crime operations. We provide therapy, legal advocacy, and education. Last year, we helped 17 children escape situations similar to what I'd experienced. We've trained over 2,000 seniors on recognizing manipulation tactics. We've worked with law enforcement in 11 states to develop better protocols for investigating family-based exploitation. Every person we help, I think about Mrs. Delacroix. I can never undo what my parents forced me to do to her and the others, but I can prevent it from happening to new victims. That's not redemption exactly, but it's something. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.